All the while that we don't have a meaningful deterrent, people are going to keep on making these journeys. And all this government has done is made a challenging problem much worse. That's reflected in these increased arrivals numbers. And with the weather window opening up, you will see people coming because they know that if they get to the United Kingdom, they will be able to stay here because this government just doesn't have the will politically to do what it takes to shut the route down once and for all and to put the criminal gangs responsible out of business.
Now, we know the Conservative government, previous Conservative government, found it tricky to close the hotels. Yes, they closed some, but also others were repurposed for asylum seekers. The government now, the Labour government, is also struggling, and it looks like they're going to be able to say, we've closed hotels, but what really has happened instead is that homes across the country are simply being used. Now, this investigation, 20 local councils already expressing an interest in participating in this £500 million Home Office scheme. And this will be for newly revamped council homes. I mean, Tom, the social contract here.
Picture this. You're on a council house waiting list. You've been there for years, paying your taxes, playing by the rules, waiting patiently for your chance at affordable housing. Then, one morning, you wake up to discover that newly refurbished council homes, the very homes you've been waiting for, are being offered to people who've just crossed the channel illegally. How would you feel? Well, according to a former Tory immigration minister, you should feel furious. And trust me, he's not holding back. Welcome back to Brit Article, where we cut through the political nonsense and serve you the facts with a side of brutal honesty. If you're new here, smash that subscribe button and hit the notifications bell because British politics just got a whole lot spicier, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Right, let's dive into the absolute political brawl that's erupted over Labour's latest housing scheme, a plan so controversial it's got former ministers practically combusting on live television. Tom Pursglove, ex-Conservative immigration minister, recently went absolutely nuclear on GB News about Labour's proposal to house illegal migrants in council homes across the UK. And when I say nuclear, I mean he didn't just criticize the policy, he absolutely dismantled it, brick by controversial brick. Here's what's happening. Labour's rolled out a £500 million pilot scheme, yes, you heard that right, £500 million to revamp council houses specifically for migrants who've crossed the channel illegally. Now, before you think I'm exaggerating, a GB News investigation found that 17 local authorities have either expressed interest or requested more information about participating in the scheme. We're talking Barnet, Bournemouth, Cheltenham, East Suffolk, Oxford, the Highlands, the list goes on. 17 councils willing to hand over council housing stock for this purpose. Let that sink in for a moment. Council houses. The same council houses that British citizens have been waiting to access. The same housing stock that's supposed to be a lifeline for working families struggling with sky-high rents and impossible property prices. Those houses are potentially being earmarked for people who've bypassed the legal immigration system entirely. Now, Pursglove didn't mince words when he heard about this. He called it completely unpalatable and completely wrong. And honestly, you could almost hear the exasperation in his voice. This is a man who, during his time as immigration minister, closed 190 asylum hotels with Robert Jenrick. 190. That's not a typo. They were actively trying to move away from dispersed accommodation and toward larger sites like the Bibby Stockton. Remember that floating accommodation barge that everyone had opinions about? The strategy was consolidation, not integration into existing housing stock that British citizens desperately need. But here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean politically explosive. Pursglove argues that this isn't just a housing issue, it's a signal, a massive, flashing neon sign to criminal gangs operating across the channel that says, get them to Britain and they'll get a council house. Because let's be real here, those gangs aren't stupid. They're running a multi-million-pound operation, and their sales pitch to desperate people relies heavily on what awaits them in the UK. Think about it from their perspective. You're a people smuggler in northern France. You're charging thousands of pounds per person for a dangerous crossing in a rubber dinghy. What do you tell your customers to justify that price tag? You tell them about the benefits, the work opportunities, the accommodation, and if the British government is literally putting illegal arrivals into council houses, that's marketing gold for the gangs. It's the ultimate pull factor. And speaking of pull factors, let's talk numbers, shall we? Just this past weekend, hundreds more migrants crossed the Channel into Britain. Hundreds in one weekend. Purseglove's reaction? It's completely unsurprising, isn't it? Because here's the harsh truth he's pointing out. Without a meaningful deterrent, people will keep making these journeys. The weather window opens up, the sea calms down, and the boats keep coming. Why? Because according to Purseglove, they know that if they get to the United Kingdom, they will be able to stay here. That's the crux of his argument, and it's worth unpacking. The former minister is essentially accusing Labour of lacking the political will to actually close Britain's borders. Strong words. He's saying the government has taken a challenging problem and made it exponentially worse. And you know what? The numbers seem to back him up. Arrivals are increasing, the crossings continue, and now there's a shiny new accommodation scheme that arguably incentivizes the very behavior the government claims to want to stop. But let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture, because this isn't happening in a vacuum. Council house waiting lists across the UK are absolutely staggering. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of British families, people who've worked, paid taxes, contributed to their communities, stuck in temporary accommodation or overpriced private rentals, desperately waiting for affordable housing. Some have been waiting for years. For them, a council house isn't just accommodation, it's a stepping stone, it's security, it's the foundation from which they can build a better life, maybe even save up to buy their own place eventually. Now, imagine you're one of those families. You've been on the list for 3 years, you've watched your kids grow up in cramped, unsuitable housing, you've paid your taxes religiously, you've done everything right. Then you discover that newly refurbished council homes, potentially the very homes you've been waiting for, are being allocated to people who arrived illegally just weeks or months ago. How is that fair? How is that remotely justifiable? Purseglove hammers this point home beautifully. He says they should be the priority when it comes to that accommodation, not small boat migrants. It's a simple statement, but it cuts to the heart of the frustration building across the country. Because this isn't about being anti-immigrant or lacking compassion. It's about priorities. It's about who gets help first. It's about whether the government's primary obligation is to its own citizens or to people who've broken immigration laws to get here. And here's where Labour's position becomes really difficult to defend. They claim they want to close the asylum hotels. Fair enough, nobody likes those either, but their solution is to move migrants into council housing instead. That's not solving the problem, that's just redistributing it. It's taking the issue out of concentrated hotel settings and spreading it across communities already struggling with housing shortages. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, except the deck chairs belong to people who've been waiting in line to use them.
Purseglove argues there's a better way. His suggestion? Large-scale accommodation sites. Centralized locations, not individual council houses scattered across communities. And crucially, here's the kicker, actually dealing with the root cause by implementing a deterrent that works. He mentions Rwanda repeatedly, that controversial scheme to relocate asylum seekers to a third country. Love it or hate it, the argument was always that it would fundamentally change the calculation for people considering the crossing. If you know you'll just be sent to Rwanda anyway, why risk the channel? But Labour scrapped Rwanda almost immediately upon taking office. They called it inhumane, unworkable, expensive, and maybe they had a point about the execution. But what's their alternative? Because from where Purseglove's sitting, and frankly, from where a lot of voters are sitting, the alternative seems to be let everyone stay, house them in council accommodation, and hope it all works out somehow. That's not a policy, that's wishful thinking. The optics of all this are absolutely disastrous for Labour.
Politically speaking, this is a gift-wrapped present to the opposition, because every single person on a council house waiting list is a potential voter who's now questioning whether this government has their best interests at heart. And in constituencies across the country, especially in those red wall seats Labor needs to hold, immigration and housing are consistently top concerns for voters. Combining those two issues into one controversial policy, that's political dynamite. Pursglove picks up on this, noting there's a growing sense of anger and frustration in the country, quite understandably. He even mentions the Bell Hotel as an example, a facility he'd closed as minister that Labor then reopened. For voters watching that happen, it's symbolic. It suggests that all the work done to reduce the asylum accommodation footprint is being undone. It suggests that priorities have shifted away from British citizens and toward illegal arrivals. And let's address the elephant in the room here, the label illegal migrants. Some people bristle at that term, preferring asylum seekers or refugees. But legally speaking, if you've crossed the Channel from France, a safe country, without authorization, you've entered the UK illegally. That's just a statement of fact. France has a functional asylum system. You don't need to risk your life crossing the Channel to claim asylum. You can do it there. So the people making that crossing aren't fleeing immediate danger in France, they're specifically choosing the UK as their destination. That's a distinction that matters. Pursglove's argument is that this choice-based migration shouldn't be rewarded with council housing, and he's got a point. Because if the message from Britain is cross illegally and we'll house you, then why would anyone bother with the legal immigration routes? Why would anyone wait years for a visa? Pay thousands in fees, jump through bureaucratic hoops if you can just show up on a boat and get accommodated? It fundamentally undermines the entire legal immigration system. Now, some will argue that these people are vulnerable, that they've made dangerous journeys, that they deserve compassion. And look, there's truth to that. Nobody denies that migration is often driven by desperation. But compassion can't override policy coherence, and policy coherence requires consistent application of rules. If the rule is that you can't just walk into Britain and demand housing, then that rule needs to apply to everyone. Otherwise, it's not really a rule at all. The criminal gangs Pursglove keeps mentioning, they understand this perfectly. They're business people, in the most cynical sense. They've identified a lucrative market and they're exploiting it ruthlessly. Every policy decision Britain makes either strengthens or weakens their business model. A strong deterrent, whether Rwanda or something else, weakens it. Free accommodation in council houses? That strengthens it. That's not speculation. That's basic market economics applied to a grim trade. So what's the solution? Well, Pursglove's got his ideas: large sites, meaningful deterrence, potentially revisiting the European Convention on Human Rights to allow easier deportations. Labor presumably has different ideas, though they seem reluctant to articulate them clearly. What's frustrating for voters is the lack of honest conversation. Nobody wants to admit that there are trade-offs here, that you can't be both completely open-hearted and completely in control of your borders, that choices have consequences, and those consequences fall hardest at the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, the very people both parties claim to champion. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Westminster wants to say out loud. The people most affected by high immigration aren't wealthy Londoners in Kensington. They're working-class families in places like Stoke, Bolton, and Hartlepool. They're the ones competing for council houses, NHS appointments, school places. They're the ones watching their communities change rapidly and wondering why nobody asked their opinion. And when politicians then propose giving newly refurbished council homes to illegal arrivals, those communities feel, rightly or wrongly, that they're being put last in their own country. That's the political powder keg Labor's sitting on with this policy, and Tom Pursglove knows it. That's why he's so vocal, so pointed in his criticism. Because from a conservative perspective, this is exactly the kind of labor policy that could shift voters back toward the Tories. It confirms every suspicion voters might have about Labor being weak on immigration, about prioritizing virtue signaling over practical governance, about being out of touch with working-class concerns. And whether Pursglove is right or wrong about the policy specifics, he's absolutely right about the politics. This is a losing issue for Labor. Every day the scheme stays in the headlines is another day voters are reminded of the immigration numbers, the housing crisis, and a government that seems more concerned about appearing compassionate than actually solving problems. And in British politics, where elections are won and lost by a few thousand votes in key constituencies, that perception could be fatal. The 17 councils that expressed interest in the scheme, they're about to find themselves in the political spotlight whether they want to be or not. Local elections are coming. Councillors will have to explain to constituents why they thought participating in this scheme was a good idea when local waiting lists stretch for years. It's not an easy conversation to have on the doorstep. And that's ultimately what makes this story so explosive. It's not just abstract policy debate, it's about real people, real homes, real frustrations. It's about a government making choices that large swaths of the electorate fundamentally disagree with. And it's about an opposition that's found an issue they can hammer relentlessly, knowing it resonates with voters. Tom Pursglove's intervention isn't just political point scoring, though it's certainly that too. It's a preview of the battle lines being drawn for the next election. Immigration, housing, sovereignty, border control. These are the issues that will dominate. And Labor's council housing scheme for illegal migrants, that'll be Exhibit A in the conservative case that Labor has lost its way. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.